Great Ideas is a program devoted to uncovering the meaning of the ideas we all use every day of our lives. In the period to follow, Dr. Mortimer J. Adler will undertake to discuss some aspect of a basic idea. Dr. Adler.
Welcome to another discussion of the great ideas. Today we shall consider the twin ideas, the inseparable ideas of war and peace. These two words, war and peace, are day in and day out on everyone's lips. It may even be that the ideas they represent are in everyone's minds. Whether or not they are clearly understood is, of course, another matter. And I am hoping that in the course of today's discussion, we can get some clarity on the meaning of these two fundamental ideas. The problem of war and peace, how to avoid war, how to secure peace, is perhaps the most important and the most urgent problem in the 20th century. It is, of course, a practical problem, a problem that can be solved only by right action, not simply by right thought. Nevertheless, the right action cannot be taken by men. It will not be taken by men unless they can think straight and do think straight about the causes and the nature of peace. Right thinking about this subject is indispensable to right action. Now, a sound understanding of war and peace exists and has existed for centuries in the tradition of the great books. It has been available to men for centuries. And yet, century after century, this sound understanding of war and peace has not been taught to the young in school, and it has not been possessed by men generally. Now, for the first time in the 20th century, people are beginning to understand, I think, more than ever before, the meanings of war and peace. The reason is the general currency of such phrases as the Cold War or the War of Nerves. The use of these phrases shows that people understand now that war exists even when the nations are not shooting at one another. And this may lead them to understand that peace, real peace, is positive, not negative. That it is not just the absence of shooting. Now, there's one other great advance that we have made in the 20th century. The 20th century is the first century when there have been world wars. This is the century of world wars. This is the first century in which the world has been physically by way of communication, by way of transport, physically small enough for a worldwide war to take place. And of course, it is also the first century in which the economic interdependence of all peoples is such that there is a conflict of interest worldwide. As a consequence of this, the 20th century is the first century when men have been able to think practically about world peace. Ours is the first century when the vision of the whole world at peace, almost the vision of the brotherhood of man, begins to look like a practicable ideal, not a utopian dream. Now, what I'd like to do in the course of our discussion today is first to clarify the meanings of war and peace, especially the meanings of these terms in the light of our understanding of the meaning of the Cold War, and the understanding that the Cold War is not peace. And then second, I would like to consider with you the conditions of peace, the conditions necessary for peace. And then finally, I'd like to ask myself and you the $64, no, I guess, in the parlance of the day, the $64,000 question. Whether world peace is possible, whether it can be made, whether world peace is, in a sense, inevitable in our century. I said that we would try first to get at the meanings of war and peace. Let's begin with the meaning of the idea of war. The usual definition of war that men give themselves is that it is the use of force or violence to obtain the objectives men seek or to resolve their differences and conflicts. And this definition of this usual conception of war applies equally to civil war, the wars of rebellion within states, as well as international war, war between states. But let me suggest to you a much deeper and I think sounder conception of war. War consists of hostile acts involving the threat of force or the use of fraud, sometimes without military action, and sometimes these things leading to and accompanied by overt military action. Now, on this conception of war, there are two different ways in which war exists. Let me show you. There is actual warfare, which is the warfare in which shooting takes place and men are killed, battles are fought. And there is war which is not actual warfare, but merely a state of war. A state of war. This distinction between actual warfare and a state of war has been made through the tradition of Western thought. Let me call your attention to this deep insight into these two modes of war that has come down to us from the 5th century BC and has been echoed century after century from the 5th century BC until our own day. Let me begin by reading you a passage from Plato in which he says that what men in general term peace is only a name. In reality, he says, every city is in a natural state of war with every other, whether or not they are actually fighting with one another. But a clearer and better statement of this, I think, very important insight, we find in the English political philosopher Thomas Hobbes. To my mind, one of the greatest statements on the subject ever made. Hobbes says, war consisteth not in battle only, or in the act of fighting, but in a tract of time wherein the will to contend by battle is sufficiently known. As the nature of foul weather lieth not in a shower or two of rain, but in an inclination thereto of many days together, so the nature of war consisteth not in actual fighting, but in the known disposition thereto. And Hobbes goes on to say, in all times, kings or sovereigns, and he might have said sovereign nations, because of their independency, are in continual jealousy, and in the state and posture of gladiators, having their weapons pointing and their eyes fixed upon one another, that is, their forts, garrisons, and guns upon their frontiers, and continual spies upon their neighbors, which is the posture of war. Or to come 2 centuries later to the great German philosopher Immanuel Kant, who says, in their external relations to one another, states, like lawless savages, are naturally in a non-juridical condition. This is a state of war in which the right of the stronger prevails, although it may not in fact always be found as a state of actual warfare or incessant hostility. And finally, in our own 20th century, Thorsten Veblen says, the state of war is the natural relation of one power to another. Now, what these writers call the state of war is what we call today the Cold War, or the war of nerves. And this Cold War, this state of war, exists between nations when there is no way, when they have no way of settling their disputes without recourse to violence. And when, because they are hostile toward one another, they are willing to resort to violence if that is necessary. Furthermore, when hostile nations leave off actual fighting, it is a mistake to suppose that they return to peace. I don't think it is true. Hostile nations are not at peace when they are not actually fighting. In the intervals between war, it would be much more accurate to say that they existed in a state of armed truce, or that an armistice obtained between them. A great ancient historian calls our attention to this point, and I'd like to take this quotation from him and apply it to the 20th century. Thucydides wrote the history of the Peloponnesian War. The Peloponnesian War usually is said to have lasted 30 years. But there was a very long period in the middle of the war, almost 7 or 8 years, when there was no fighting going on, when fighting stopped, and then after this long interval, fighting was resumed. Now, though the war is called 30 years long, Thucydides says only a mistaken judgment can object to including the interval of the treaty, this short period when there was a treaty between the Peloponnesians, the Spartans and the Athenians. Only a mistaken judgment, he says, can object to including the treaty, the interval of the treaty, in the war. Looked at in the light of the facts, Thucydides says, it cannot be rationally considered a state of real peace, where neither party gave or got back all they had agreed upon. In other words, you have here what we have here in the 20th century. In 1914, a world war begins. It is fought until 1918. And then you have a 20-year period, 21-year period, when it looks as if you have peace. Why isn't it accurate to say with Thucydides that that wasn't really a peace, but an armistice, an armed truce, when war breaks out again, and this armed truce becomes an actual fighting war in 1939, 1940. The modern writer on this subject says that peace established by the state is necessarily of the nature of an armistice, in effect terminable at will and on short notice. And perhaps the easiest way of making this point is to look at the remark made by the German military strategist, writer on war, General von Clausewitz. Von Clausewitz says that war is nothing but the continuation of the activity of the diplomats, the activity of the Foreign Office by other means, now by the means of the military. But you can reverse von Clausewitz's statement. You can reverse von Clausewitz's statement. You can say that the activity of the diplomats, the activity of the foreign offices, is nothing but the continuation during the time of no fighting, no shooting, of the activity performed on the battlefields by the generals and on the seas by the admirals and the navies. Now, if one turns from this understanding of war and its two modes, the active fighting, shooting, the hot war, and the state of war, which is not a fighting war, but a cold war, a war of nerves, one can, I think, get light on the nature of peace. The vulgar misconception of peace follows upon the usual definition of war. It is just a negative conception of peace. It is the conception that peace is merely nothing but the absence of fighting. But such peace, the absence of fighting between really hostile nations, is not peace. In fact, it is exactly the same as the Cold War. Let me put that down. The negative peace, which is nothing but the absence of fighting between hostile nations, is identical with the state of war, with the Cold War. It doesn't really add anything to the notion of the Cold War. And what I've just said about the relation between states is equally true within a state. For when people are conquered or ruled unjustly, underneath the enforced order of the conqueror, there is always rebellion seething, waiting to break out. You have a state of war there too. What then is genuine peace? What then is positive peace? Something which is peace and not the equivalent of a state of war. A peace which is not only distinct from the Cold War, but distinct from actual warfare. I think that to understand peace positively, we must say that men are at peace when it is not necessary, not when they do not have to resort to violence, when they can settle their disputes and obtain their objectives without the use of force or violence. How then do they settle their disputes or attain their objectives if they have not recourse to violence or the use of force? The answer is in two words: by the appeal to law, and by the practices of law, and by the practices of conversation. This, it seems to me, is a very important set of notions, that the use of law and of conversation constitutes the making of peace positively. Again, let me call your attention to two writers, one the ancient Cicero, the other the modern English political philosopher Locke, who call attention to the fact that human beings can settle their differences either in peaceful or in belligerent ways. Cicero says, there are two ways of settling disputed questions, one by discussion, the other by force. The first being characteristic of man, the second of brutes. We should have recourse to the latter only if the former fails. And John Locke again makes the same kind of point when he says, there are two sorts of contests among men, the one managed by law, the other by force. And these are of such a nature that where the one ends, the other begins. Now let's think about this concretely for a moment in terms of the United States. Here we are in the United States, 175 million people living at peace. What is the peace that we, 175 million of us, enjoy in the United States today? Does it consist in the absence of conflicts? Does it consist in the absence of quarrels among our citizens? Not at all. We do have conflicts of interest and quarrels, but we can always settle them without resort to violence by the appeal to law or to conversation, by using talk instead of force. Nor does it mean that all our institutions are perfectly just. On the contrary, our Constitution, our form of government still, I'm sure, can be improved. But we can get greater justice in this country. We can improve our Constitution and improve our form of government by due process of law. We do not have to resort to rebellion. This is the reason why we have civil peace in the United States of America today. Now then, with that understood, let's ask what conditions, what facts are indispensable to the existence and maintenance of such peace. First, in terms of the understanding of war and peace we have just achieved, let us observe a widely prevalent misunderstanding of history. As history is taught to the children in school, and as it is believed by most of us, it is taught and understood by us to be a succession of wars, each followed by a peace between the nations which were at war, which were fighting against one another, a peace concluded by something called a peace treaty. We talk about declarations of war, the conduct of war, the end of a war, and the conclusion of a war, the making of peace by a peace treaty. Or we sometimes understand history as involving peace through the conquest of a great power, the subduing by a great power of its enemies, so that that hostility is put an end to and peace is made by conquest. Now this is a great mistake. As history should be taught us, and as we ought to understand the facts of history, we should never think of treaties as making peace. For between hostile nations, there is only a state of war, even when they have made a treaty of peace. And we should never think of conquest as making peace. For when the conqueror puts down the enemy, all he has done is allow the subjugated to exist under his heel, waiting to rebel, and a state of war exists there as well. Now the only real peace, the only positive peace that the world has ever seen has not been a peace between nations or between states, but a peace that exists within nations or states. If I just remind you of what we said a moment ago, you will see that this is the case, that positive peace consists of men living together in such a way that they have means of resolving their difficulties, means of resolving their conflicts without the resort to force or violence. And to have such means, two things must be available to them. They must live under law, a law that is enforced equally and justly, and they must be able to settle their differences by conversation, by talking instead of fighting. Now, I know I've used the word talking and conversation several times in the course of our discussion, and you may think that I have overemphasized this notion of conversation in relation to peace. But to show you that this is not the case, let me remind you of the language of diplomacy. The diplomats, when an international crisis is brewing, often say, and the press in its headlines reports it this way, that conversations are rapidly deteriorating. When a conference is called between leading powers and things aren't going well, they say, conversations are rapidly deteriorating. And then, in the 11th hour, in the last moment, before war is declared, the headlines of our great metropolitan dailies will carry the words, "Conversations have completely broken down." And when conversations have completely broken down, there is nothing left for the nations who have real differences, real conflict, and real interest at stake, but to resort to force. When conversations have completely broken down, then the armies march, the navies sail, and bombs begin to drop. Now, if you understand the importance of law and law enforcement and conversation as the elements, the sinews of peace, you will see that the one indispensable condition for the existence of peace is government. For government in a society provides the reign of law, it provides the enforcement of law, and it provides the machinery for keeping the conversation going. What do I mean when I say this last thing, that government provides the machinery for keeping the conversation going? I mean all the apparatus of courts and the kind of legal formalities that take place in courts when things come to trial and things are contested by law rather than by force. All the machinery of debate in and outside of deliberative assemblies, and even such matters as voting on men and issues. Even that is a way of deciding important things by talk rather than by force. That's how government is fundamentally the machinery for keeping the conversation going. Ambassador Jessup, in a recent book, said, when government provides the processes for correcting abuses by nonviolent means, or for settling differences by nonviolent means, then, he says, there is no need to exercise the right of revolution. Now, on this view of what positive peace is, let's look at history again. Let's look at history again and see how peace has grown, how peace has developed over the century. What we find is that there is an enlargement of the areas of peace. There is an enlargement of the units of peace. Consider each society, each political community where men live together under government as a unit or area of peace. Over the 25 centuries or the 50 centuries of man's life on Earth, the peace units, the areas of peace, have grown larger and larger and larger in size, so that now in our world, hundreds of millions of men can live together in peace, whereas in antiquity, the peace units seldom numbered more than 50 or 100,000. What has happened is that the size of the community has grown from tribe or village to the small city, to the city-state, to the nation, to the large nation, to the great federal nations of the modern world. This is the sense in which there's been progress in peace. Peace has been spread on the earth. But if this is true, it is also true that in the whole history of the past, all we have made is not peace, but pieces. And I write that word down so that you hear me say it in the plural. Pieces, not peace. There have been as many pieces, local pieces, as there have been pieces. There have been a peace in this city or this state, this nation. Wherever there has been a local unit of government, wherever there has been a political community living under government, there has been peace. And so pieces have existed on earth in the plural, local, citywide pieces, or nationwide pieces. But nowhere on earth, not in the past and not in the present, has there been one single universal peace. That's the problem. That's the problem we face finally. Can we make one peace out of all these pieces? Can we make a world peace? As in the past we have succeeded, men have succeeded in making these smaller units of peace and making them grow so that the units of peace in the modern world are very much larger than they were in antiquity. The problem is, can we have world peace, one, universal, and indivisible? The answer to that question can be given in what looks like an axiom, a political axiom, or self-evident truth. It is that if government is necessary for local peace, that is, if government in the United States is necessary for peace in the United States, the government of England for the peace of the people of England, the government of France for the peace of the people of France, if government is necessary for each of these local units of peace, then it would seem to follow, without any doubt, that world government is necessary for world peace. the question remains, is world government possible? Is world peace possible if it requires or depends upon world government? That is the difficult question, and yet I think we must answer it by saying that world peace and world government are difficult, very difficult things to achieve, and yet not impossible. All the lessons of history which have taught us how men have made and enlarged the units of peace from the smallest tribal unit to the great modern state, teach us also that it is possible, difficult, but possible, to make the whole world a single unit of peace. Yet the price may be too high. The price may be too high. For what the price is the surrender of certain aspects of national sovereignty and the subordination of other aspects of national sovereignty to the higher sovereignty, the higher lawful sovereignty of a world government. I would say in the first instance, a world federal government. Will we pay that price? That all depends, I'm afraid, on how much men want peace. Clemenceau, who was Prime Minister of France during the First World War, said, "Men say they want peace, but they do not want the things that make for peace." So far, in this century, men and nations do not seem to have been willing to pay the price for peace. But atomic warfare may change their minds on that subject. And atomic power making the world smaller as well as making the threat of the next war and the next war more terrible, also changes the whole aspect of the question of war and peace. I think perhaps the most incisive remark that can be made on the subject has been made by the great English historian and philosopher of history, Arnold Toynbee. He says, "It is no longer a question of whether world peace is possible in our day, for we now must face the fact that world peace is inevitable in the near future. And the only practical question we face is how it is going to come, either by force and conquest and war on the one hand, or by law and consent on the other. That is our only choice." Now this must conclude our discussion of these two ideas, these connected ideas of war and peace. Next time, we shall consider another great idea and deal with some of the fundamental problems it raises. I hope you'll be with us again. Thank you very much.